Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are logging in from. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and the center's mission is to anticipate and address, help people anticipate and address tomorrow's information security problems in order to amplify the upside of the digital revolution. And in that vein, we're really excited today to a conversation about the security and privacy risks in the hybrid work environment. CLTC recently published a research white paper on this topic. And today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the issues that we should all be paying more attention to with the hybrid and remote work environment, as well as solutions. And so it's actually my great pleasure today to welcome two Cal alums to this panel. It's not every day we have a panel with 100% Cal alumni participation, who also both happen to be at firms that are at the very sharp end of the spear for enabling the hybrid work environment for everybody else. So I'm pleased to introduce Will Cooper, Vice President of Litigation and Compliance at the S&P 500 cybersecurity company Fortinet. And prior to Fortinet, Will practiced law at several law firms and is a graduate of Berkeley Law.
Thanks, Ann.
Welcome, Will. I'm also delighted to introduce Greg Silverman, Associate General Counsel at Zoom Video Communications Global Privacy Team. Prior to joining Zoom, Greg was the Deputy General Counsel for BlackBerry Corporation and was also a partner in the cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection practice in the Palo Alto offices of Jones Day. He's also a graduate of UC Berkeley and started his legal career at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. So welcome, Greg. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Ann. Appreciate it. Hey, Will, good to see you.
Hey, Greg, good to see you too.
Well, and so I also just want to thank Zoom and Fortinet, along with EY, who helped support CLTC's research on hybrid work, which, as I said, we published as a white paper recently and can be found on our website. And with that, and no further ado, I want to dive in deeper on these questions with Will and Greg. But to start out, Greg and Will, we often have a lot of students in our audience. And so we usually ask our panelists, just tell us very briefly, what's your day job and how did you get into the cybersecurity field? So Will, let me start with you.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Ann. So I'm an attorney at Fortinet. We're as Ann mentioned, a S&P 500 cybersecurity company. So our primary product that we sell out into the marketplace is a firewall, which inspects all the traffic that comes in and out of networks, obviously a very central part of cybersecurity. And my responsibilities include privacy and cybersecurity, and I also work on litigation and intellectual property matters. And I got my schooling here at Berkeley about 10 years ago. I was at two large law firms and then went in-house to Fortinet that was a client. So that's my story.
Great, thank you. And Greg, yeah, same question. What's your day job like and how did you get into cybersecurity?
Sure. I'm Greg Silverman. I'm the AGC at Zoom Video Communications. 5 years ago, I would have had to explain what the company did and who we were, and I'd be saying things like, it's kind of like WebEx, but better. And now, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, everyone knows the name Zoom. I run our global privacy team, but what that really means is I have about a dozen attorneys and analysts and a data governance manager who I work with, and we do everything. We handle everything from working with product security and product privacy engineering teams to help them develop privacy by design. We also run regulatory sort of compliance operations, everything from responding to data subject access requests to questions regarding COPPA compliance for children who are going to school over Zoom. And then also, I do work with our government relations team and strategic biz dev teams as far as entry into new marketplaces and determining, well, what do we have to do to comply with new regulatory regimes all over the world, since I think we are currently in 170 countries and counting.
Great. Well, thank you. And suffice it to say, you've both been extremely busy over the past 2 years in particular. And just to the audience, Will and Greg have graciously agreed to share their contact details, which we'll share at the end of this conversation. If anybody wants to follow up on what you just heard about their work. But let's dive into privacy and security in the hybrid and remote work environment. And we've all had these experiences in the last 24 months, but to set the stage, let's just start with some anecdotes. And so I want to address this question to both of you. Just tell us about an experience that you've observed or you've had yourself where you encountered a different privacy and or security restriction or responsibility in a remote environment versus the physical office. Just to kind of get us started so people can understand the kinds of problems we're talking about here. So Greg, let me turn to you first for that.
Sure. One thing is, as many people have experienced now, is with remote or hybrid work during the pandemic, people moved out of cities. They maybe went to, if they had the opportunity and the wherewithal, some went to parents' house, some went to, remote vacation destinations. I have experienced an employee removing themselves to Baku, Azerbaijan. Not a commentary on Baku or Azerbaijan in any way. However, at the time, we were not set up to accommodate remote work from that area of the world. And this was initially presented as, oh, I'll be working on Eastern Standard Time. You're going to go back east to visit parents? No, I'm going home. Where's home? Baku. As in Azerbaijan? Yes. It's like, have you spoken to HR or security, because there are export controls on some of the hardware that you need to do your daily job. You have access to sensitive material in your role. And so it was evaluating employees that now are scattering, and not just sort of remote in time, which makes scheduling a little more difficult, which is an issue, but sometimes moving into different jurisdictions where their privacy laws, the security laws, the access by local law enforcement is different. And all of a sudden you have employees in jurisdictions which you never planned for. And so having to address those needs and saying, you can take vacation, we have unlimited vacation time if you need to go home. You can take a leave of absence if you need for reasons, but no, you cannot go work remotely from certain jurisdictions because we're just not set up for it. And so not really a question I'd seen or had to approach was addressing employee as well as customer security and privacy due to, spontaneous notice of relocation of workforce.
Yeah, really interesting and really sets, I think, up the conversation well for a question about what does one size fits all mean in this new world we're inhabiting. But let me turn to Will. So yeah, maybe just set the stage with something from your own experience that you've observed over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think anecdotally for me, it's been really interesting to watch my competency on Zoom. I won't mention for out of respect for Greg, any competitors to Zoom on this call, but as we know, we all are using a variety of tools, but Zoom is the best. But from the beginning, 2 years ago, I almost never did a Zoom call. And then all of a sudden it went from, almost exclusively phone calls and dial-ins to, throughout the day, 4 or 5, sometimes even more video calls. And at the very beginning, my background was always a mess. I forgot about it. I tried to, bring images on from the website and, from the web to have a fun background. And I'd forget to lock my door and my young kids would come charging in. And just my own competency and some others' competency has just gotten much better. And that helps with obviously professionalism and other things. So just getting more fluent in this new world has been an evolution for me. Fortunately, I haven't had any situations that were too painful. But looking back, I do remember, that I have come a long way, and it's been a good process because it is nice to be able to communicate this way. There is more information you can share than just on the telephone, and so it's been a good evolution.
Yeah, thanks so much for those reflections, both of you. Well, what you said is making me think how different, how far of a way we've come in terms, I think, also of consent in meetings. In the physical office environment, you would never think of having to check a box saying, like, I'm aware this is being recorded. But now we do that every day on, whatever video conference platform we happen to be using. But we still don't do that in the physical office environment. So we'll get to talking a little bit more about that. But, to follow on from the reflections that you both just shared, how has that changed your thinking? I think specifically, in your job and for your clients and for your customers, what's the number one aspect of privacy and security in this remote and hybrid new workplace that you think people just aren't paying enough attention to? And let me go back to Greg to take the first crack at that one.
I really see two. First, mixing of personal and professional. Now that there are more and more, I've been home for 5 years, and it took a while in working remote because of various roles in companies where I've had to learn to adapt. So when the pandemic came, I'd already been doing this for a period of time, but for most of us, it's a new experience. And so using a broader range of tools, whether it's video conferencing. I mean, I can tell you just from internal statistics, the number of people that now know how to find the virtual background or blur or upload their own virtual background spiked. That feature's been around for a very long time, but its utilization has gone through the roof because more people are on it, but also people that had accounts previously that never would have bothered because it was so infrequent now use it all the time. If you look at this from the standpoint of IT resources, people are now, they're in their home, they are doing their taxes. And even though people might incidentally have used their work computer, very often they would have saved, some things, to do later. You're connected to your home network, you're connected to your home printer, you're connected to all these technologies. And all of a sudden, that boundary starts to blur. And I think that's an area where individuals need to focus the most. And then the other was non-IT resources, things such as mail. It's, I know we've all imagined, it's all electronic mail and a paperless desktop, but whether it's government agencies, whether it is outside law firms or other organizations, there's still a good deal of mail and paper record that still comes through. And how do you address that in the home environment? Or if you're working with hardware, or if you are having to deal with physical security, and depending upon your role and what you're working on, you may need a certain amount of isolation or physical security to meet regulatory or compliance guidelines. If you're working with medical records in any way, if you're working with HR records, if you're dealing with a wide variety of client material as an attorney, as an analyst, as a doctor, you have obligations to secure that. Are people providing that in their home? These are all concerns that I think we need to sort of look to as we move away from ad hoc sort of emergency procedures that were adopted at the beginning of the pandemic and more towards a sort of sustainable pattern of behavior and work in a future that's going to see more and more hybrid and remote work.
Yeah, I think that point you made about physical mail is so interesting and emblematic of a larger point, in this emergency ad hoc posture that we've been in for the past couple of years. It's really easy to get distracted by the digital revolution and the new technology and securing our digital lives and lose all attention to, legacy systems like physical mail. Some of those legacy systems are physical, some of them are actually legacy software systems, but we see over and over again that people get so distracted by the emerging technology that we forget to do the block and tackle of the legacy systems.
Or just even, an odd one was just redirecting of mail. or collecting mail and then mailing it on to someone at their home or their vacation home, because that's where they're currently residing. And then how is that going to make it back into a proper system? Or one instance that I'd heard of, not something Zoom did, because we've been very hybrid and remote from the beginning, was a law firm that basically had people go into the office and scan everything that was physical mail and then email that out to various attorneys, paralegals, and they had just undertook this massive scanning operation. But then now they had paper copies, and now they had digitized electronic copies, and some of those digitized electronic copies may be material that is more sensitive than was intended to be digitized and sent via unencrypted email.
It becomes a hall of mirrors at some point. Well, Will, let me turn to you and ask the same question. How have the experiences over the last 24 months, both for you and your colleagues and your clients, changed your thinking? And what do you think that, all of us need to be paying more attention to?
It's a great question. I think Greg did a very good job of articulating, the really personal dimensions here. And I think how you deal with your own mail is a great example of that. So I'll take a step back and add from a more macro perspective, what people are not fully appreciating. It might not be as true on this particular webinar because of the people that have signed up are interested in cybersecurity. But I think in general, there's a really underestimation of how pervasive the challenges are and how much from an already very high base, things have gotten even more challenging. So when everybody when you have 75 to 80% of work going on at a corporate network on premises to 5 to 10%, it creates a much more complicated network with a big, huge web of potential vulnerabilities. And all of that is layered on top of a world where the incentive to build out infrastructure, build out the internet is enormous and already outpacing the cybersecurity dimension, which is typically looked at as more of an expense. So just the magnitude of the vulnerability from the cyber perspective, I think, is not appreciated. You see headlines, you see Colonial Pipeline, you see SolarWinds in the paper, but the overall pervasiveness globally of the challenge, I don't think most people fully appreciate.
That is actually a perfect segue to the next thing I wanted to ask both of you about. You could argue that even before the shift to remote and hybrid work, we were underestimating the cybersecurity challenges and underestimating the magnitude of the challenge. And we, all have some bad habits and some old assumptions when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy. And so the optimistic view and the amplify the upside view, which is the stance that CLTC often likes to take, is maybe this shift to remote and hybrid work actually offers an opportunity to rethink some of those longstanding bad habits, for companies to do new creative things, in terms of more meaningful and responsive employee training on cybersecurity, or in terms of accelerating a shift away from single authentication. I offer that a little bit as a provocation because I would really love to hear both of your viewpoints on this case for optimism. So Will, I'll actually go back to you first. Have you seen some creative solutions, or what's the most creative thing you've seen in the field in response to hybrid work that maybe has the potential to break some of these bad habits and help us with the magnitude of this challenge?
I think you using the phrase bad habits is spot on and actually really important because so much of cybersecurity is human behavior. Obviously, a big part of it is plugging in firewalls into your network. It is encrypting data at rest and in transit. And there's a big technological component. But a huge part of it, and this is what I see day in and day out, as you said, Anne, at the tip of the spear, a huge part of it is organizational culture and the human dimension and people's habits and what they are thinking about and how attuned and sensitized they are to, not click on that link from an email that they're not familiar with, or not, not forget to add that extra layer of authentication on their laptop. And so focusing on the human part of it, and I think a really good, you're seeing a lot of really good innovations, a lot of really good creativity on the training side. Fortinet does that. We have a national security education, or excuse me, network security education program, and a lot of other companies as well. So focusing not just on, here's how this box is going to filter out bad traffic, but here's how we can get our organization to remember to have good etiquette and good hygiene. I think it's a really important focus, because you're exactly right. We need to change habits, not just, innovate technologically.
Yeah, let me drill down on that just a little bit, because for us, like, this exchange between industry and academia is so important, and I'd love to get down into details if there's anything you can think of. As I think all of us have experienced, including us here at UC Berkeley, sometimes cybersecurity training can be just a compliance exercise, check the box. Have you seen something that you think people are doing differently in the field that has real promise?
I think bringing really creative ideas into the sphere has worked. I've seen video games where you're actually playing games. But I think training in cybersecurity is going to be similar to training in other areas. What captures people's attention? You don't want it to be too long, then people space out. You don't want it to be, required to be done at times where people are busy. We wouldn't roll out training at the end of our quarter, things like that. But bringing in a lot of the new gaming technology, I think, is a good example where you can excite people. And then another thing you can do to really get people engaged is remind them of all the examples that continue to show up on the front page of the paper of what happens when you make mistakes, right? The SolarWinds hack, for example, very consequential. It led to foreign adversary getting in the US government. And ultimately, if you trace that back, somebody, somewhere, or some set of people made mistakes, right? They didn't pay attention to their training and they clicked on that link. They made a similar mistake. And so, trying to be creative, get people excited, and frankly, scare people, I think, is a good combination, and the best training programs do that. And I know from speaking to some of the students at Berkeley, and there is a focus on training, and there's some really good innovation coming out of Berkeley in that area.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, I was just going to say the students in our Masters of Information and Cybersecurity program, I've seen some really good capstone projects that take that concept of gaming, and so
Exactly.
for the students on, I think they'll be excited to hear that observation.
Great.
I think just a tiny
Yeah, jump in,
that,
Greg.
I 100% agree with Will that you can't do long training, you can't do end of quarter in our business, because people would just be, they're trying to close deals. But I think shorter, better in situ, like training, for the appropriate thing you're working on. Micro trainings, like 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I don't know if anyone's familiar with a company called Habituate that was recently bought by Arctic Wolf. They're, short video trainings of just dealing with password strength, and I'm a bigger fan of using humor than fear, because people get sort of beat down on fear. Last year, for privacy awareness, we did we do things in conjunction with cybersecurity, but we did a contest on label a USB thumb drive, and we'll do a contest to see who can come up with the best label to try and attract somebody to plug it in. And people came up with, like, keeping up with the Kardashian outtakes, or labeling it Bitcoin or confidential, and just doing contests, doing things that people can actually be involved with in touch. Sort of breakdowns where we're fortunate we have some people with, experience from intelligence services who've done presentations to explain how various forms of social engineering work with demonstrations. And it's kind of amazing when you see it happening. Not that I want to send everyone off to DEF CON to watch, the capture the, the OSINT capture the flag exercises, as they call people, and you torture, poor receptionists to get them to give up IP addresses and login credentials. But watching sort of real demos of it rather than just sort of the wall of text and the threat and the parade of horrible, I think is important. And then just avoiding the training fatigue is critical. So mixing it in, giving people opportunities, like you have to do it sometime this month. It's 3 to 5 minutes. Here's a nudge, go.
Yeah, well, and I'll take that nudge to plug usable security research, which, as both of you know, is a huge strength here at Berkeley. And I personally think is something that the world needs a heck of a lot more of. But Greg, let me follow up with you as well on this question about moving away from bad habits. Do you see that the playing field isn't level for people in terms of privacy across the physical and hybrid and remote locations? And do you think there's an opportunity to level it? Do you think there's an opportunity to change bad habits? And if so, how?
So I think there's an opportunity, but it's a very complex problem. It's early days. And unfortunately, I am greatly concerned that we are going to see sort of concerns around productivity and security to drive an increase in employee monitoring. We've already seen it. Companies that sell the tools and technologies to do employee monitoring, to do algorithmic management have seen a tremendous spike in the last 18 months. Use of productivity tools, just in identity and access management tools, device management, performance monitoring, and straight up surveillance technologies have the potential to invade employees at home in ways that were inconceivable 5 or 10 years ago. And employee monitoring, badging in, badging out, that sort of tracking to see if you showed up is one thing at the office. And even there is concerning and, but now moving that to people's homes is very concerning to me. It's also been, produced some truly hilarious countermeasures that we see to, people's DIY attempts to level the playing field, everything from standees to video loops to, a cottage industry of software that will make it appear as if you are online and doing your job, to, I think my favorite so far is anybody who wants afterwards or later while we're getting boring, do a search on Amazon for mouse mover or mouse jiggler. This is a technology that's entirely a result of, bossware that's monitoring activity, and it will create sort of a random pattern of behavior so it looks like a human is engaging with a computer. And the fact that there's not one or two, but that you can get dozens of Amazon results shows that this cottage industry has blown up. So I look at that and I wonder, gee, are you really going to plug in a random mouse jiggler, mouse mover, and hope that it isn't actually a key catcher, and that it's recording your keystrokes and reporting those to someone else? I don't know. But I do have concerns about it. I think that, we have to ask the question of, in remote environments, whose privacy are we protecting? A lot of things that have been pushed towards being, oh, well, we need this for the privacy of the customer data or the security of our environment or the office. We need to balance out against that employees, particularly in the United States, where there is not as broad a privacy regime, where we don't have works counsel to protect employees. I think that's an area where we really do need to focus, and that is concerning. And so we have to break, we have to stop some of these bad habits before they expand, and we start stuffing, something that's like, oh, this is for security, and then it takes on a certain amount of function creep, and all of a sudden it becomes for, performance monitoring or applying algorithms to manage people and making decisions about, well, I'm not sure about Greg, and we're not going to, look at his meeting durations, or look at this. We don't think he's being as attentive or working as much, and his keyboard stroke count is down. Maybe he's drinking. we're going to make a guess about that. I think that's something very important, is that, something that starts out for a necessary security or regulatory compliance feature doesn't creep into an impermissive surveillance of employees and an impermissive application of artificial intelligence and machine learning to evaluating and managing employees.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, I think you've brought up a couple of points. I think one very much reinforcing what Will was saying a few minutes ago about the importance of culture, and how might we get away from just a culture of attendance, which is what those kind of mouse jiggler, keyboard stroke things are able to measure at this point. And then I think you've raised a really good point, Greg, about for any of these things, asking the question, under what circumstances and for whom are we creating this policy, whether it's government policy or a corporate policy, and it could look really different for someone in a law firm or workers who staff call centers who all of a sudden have been sent home to do that work from the home environment. Will, I see you nodding. Did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was just nodding in agreement, and I think those are really good points. And I think I agree with Greg's points as well, and emphasize, I think, that the technology that Greg talked about, I mean, it, like many areas of technology, growing incredibly fast, incredible innovations, and the regulatory environment, complete other end of the continuum, moves very, very slow. In some places, including at the federal level, doesn't move at all in a lot of respects. So there is a growing disconnect. And of course, if you have an area where there isn't regulatory potential liability there, it's really hard to clamp down on things that might pose risks. And at this point, I think that divide between the regulatory regime and the innovation is just growing larger. One other point I'd add about leveling the playing field briefly is from coming at it from another angle. I do think, and the white paper that the center wrote on this, I thought made a really good point. You do see in this in the economy very, very big differences depending on socioeconomics, right? Some people are able to walk, up several flights of stairs, close a door, lock it, enter their office with 3 computer screens, Wi-Fi pumping, and all of the privacy and insularity they want, and not get disrupted, and be able to function up in their study exactly the way they want to in this digital world. And then other people that don't have the resources, who have lots of roommates or kids running around, don't have, they're working on their kitchen table as opposed to, their own office. That can create a whole lot of friction and challenge for people in that latter category. And that's something that I think we need to focus on and try to figure out more and more ways to level that playing field, because it just exacerbates, pre-existing disparities in ways that, for those of us who have, easy access to these technologies, might not appreciate.
Well, or just even the fact that a smartphone at a certain level becomes almost a tax on, workers at a certain level, or access to, high-speed internet. These are all things that, become necessity for remote work, that all of a sudden, when those aren't available, or when it's something you now have to maintain, it gets harder and harder to do the job. You're facing greater pressure, greater stress. Yeah. And what does that do to the employee, particularly if they're in a circumstance where they are subject to some sort of persistent monitoring of performance?
Absolutely.
Yeah, +1, I think those are both just outstanding points and really important. Particularly the point about equity. So thank you for raising that. I'm gonna just say to the audience, please, at this time, if you want to start asking any questions in the Q&A box, as Rachel had suggested, we'll take those questions in just a couple of minutes. I'm gonna ask our panelists one more question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. But so Greg and Will, kind of following on this conversation then about different regulatory environments, different privacy regimes, and equity. You know, assuming the hybrid work environment is here to stay, what would you like to see from policymakers in the next, say, 18 months that would catalyze real progress on privacy and security in this, you know, hybrid work environment that's here to stay? And why don't I go to you first, Greg?
I know it sounds like a little bit of a drumbeat here, but for me, it's going to be regulation of employee monitoring and algorithmic management. There's been a bill recently introduced in the Massachusetts state legislature that aims to protect workers from non-consensual capture of information or communications within the individual's home. However, it's kind of weak, and it doesn't exist within a larger legal framework for safeguarding the privacy of remote workers, you know, particularly at the federal level. So all of a sudden, you know, yes, it's not communications, but I could capture your keystrokes, or I could capture what apps you are running. And some of these are, I don't even need to install BOSS or surveillanceware. I can do this off of security tools that are doing identity and access management. Georgetown Center for Privacy Technology released a draft of the Worker Privacy Act of 2020, which proposed a federal law that would establish, you know, clear prohibitions on use of data and require employers to explain what data they collect in addition to why they're handling it. And there are proposals for creation of a new division of the Department of Labor, but so far no one's really driving this. And some of the state privacy laws, such as we have here in California, you know, we'll have to see if it does sort of transition over to employee rights, and if, you know, when I submit a data subject access request as an employee to my employer, how much information am I going to get back? And even if they do give me information, you know, am I going to be able to interpret how that has been used to then, you know, review whether or not I'm being subjected to, you know, algorithmic management, whether or not I'm, you know, to what degree am I being monitored? And I think a lot of these technologies, I think we're going to have to see employers balancing, you know, the risks to losing the trust of their employees, as well as, you know, creating a potential significant regulatory burden in having to respond. If you're monitoring my actions 24/7, you know, that's going to be a lot to turn over when I submit my DSAR request.
Yeah, really interesting. And I can tell from the questions that, you know, this is something that I think we'll continue to drill down on in the Q&A. But Will, let me give you a chance to respond to that question in terms of, you know, what could policymakers, whether that's, you know, policy that's set in corporate boardrooms or policy that's set at a government entity, do over the next 18 months to really catalyze better privacy and security, do you think?
Yeah, keeping with the theme where Greg focuses more on the personal side, and then I take a more macro perspective and from this, looking at it from the cybersecurity side. I think that regulation in the cybersecurity space is quite sparse compared to other areas. So for example, if you go to Wall Street, big banks will have entire floors of their headquarter building filled with regulators, right? There's over a century of practice and build up, and you know, entire armies of regulators that are focused on how these companies are handling money that they have, and how they're treating their customers and consumers. And then you know, go a couple thousand miles to the West Coast in Silicon Valley, and you have these huge giants where data, instead of money, well, they certainly have money as well, but the huge troves of data, the regulatory attention and focus is, you know, unbelievably small fraction there. And so one of the things that all for-profit organizations do is they look at regulation, and they look at what the potential consequences are, and that impacts investment, it impacts hiring, it impacts how they're approaching these issues. So I think when Congress is looking at trying to get better cyber practices, and you see some ad hoc things going on, President Biden will hold a roundtable where he asks a bunch of tech companies to help, and there is good collaboration between the private sector and the government in many respects. But without there actually being real consequences, you're not going to see the entire marketplace of companies that have lots of data protecting it in the right way. So I think bringing data, cybersecurity, and data regulations into some sort of parity with other areas that are regulated, that are equally or even less important, I think is going to be important to actually incentivizing the private sector to spend more and put more resources into cybersecurity.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I am going to turn to our audience Q&A. So our first question is kind of going back to the point about the function creep of security and compliance tools and issues around privacy. And this question is kind of in addition to some of the policy mechanisms that we've just put on the table, other thoughts about how to prevent the scope or the function creep, and any examples of any place you think is doing this really well already. And I'll throw that out to both of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
Go ahead, Greg. I think you raised the
Sure.
function.
No, I'm happy to. I'm just trying to fight my urge to always be the first one to speak
No,
and rein in that impulse control. So I think the important thing is to recognize that this function creep isn't presence just in spyware or bossware. It is presence across all of the technology services that we use. The logging function, in a productivity tool, even this Zoom meeting, you can have a webinar and we're all attending this webinar and there'll be a record of webinar attendees. If this was a meeting with hundreds of people all over the world, some of those employees, and this was a work function, some of those employees might have concerns about how are they being monitored by their attendance, and is there the fact that they were 10 minutes late or 20 minutes late, is that being measured? Some organizations might comb through that data and then make a statement to their sales organization or their engineering organ saying a third of your people showed up late or showed up and then left early. You have to do something about this, causing the use of a tool that's just intended for one purpose to be co-opted for another. Or something that Zoom, we developed presence, the ability to tell if someone's actually in front of the camera when you're talking to it, and activity monitoring, and after the fact recognized that, hey, wait, this is invasive, and so deprecated the functionality when it was called to our attention. It wasn't ever intended to be a way to monitor employees or monitor students, but just to make sure that, hey, is there actually anybody there? Is someone, would give people the ability to go off camera. And, as that functional creep or use of, and unintended consequences becomes a concern, having to look at that and reevaluate continuously is important. So to sort of bring back, that core idea of, privacy by design is important, but having to constantly reevaluate functions and how they're actually used, I think is critical. I'd love to imagine a day when we see greater sort of regulatory framework around this, particularly if it could lean towards sort of greater harmonization. But I think we're still going to be a ways off. We're unable to see a replacement for Privacy Shield, and that has a tremendous commercial value. I think it's going to be a bit before the U.S. recognizes the need and importance to protect employee rights at anything approaching the federal level.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be a while. And another example of something that I think, going back to incentives of organizations and where they're putting their resources and how they're changing their behavior, Another thing that is not very well developed is on the civil litigation side. So companies are very scared of class actions. There's extremely robust class action practice, for example, in consumer products, right? If you label your product in a misleading way, you know that there's going to be a lot of lawyers looking at your products, and you're going to get sued. And some of these class actions can be extremely expensive for customers. Securities class action is another one. Companies are very careful what they say on their earnings calls, for example, to not say anything misleading. What we have not seen at all in the courts is a meaningful move towards a well-developed sense of what sorts of damages are associated with violations, if any. And so there's lots of good citizens in corporate America. There's lots of companies that want to do the right thing and do the right thing, but there's also a percentage of the marketplace that needs to be deterred. And if they know that a big $100 million class action is going to be filed against them, if they're violating all of their employees' privacies in certain ways, that's going to prevent them from doing it more so, on average, than in the absence of that sort of deterrent. And right now, the courts and the jurisprudence really has not developed in a way where that big deterrent factor is there. I think it's moving in that direction, but it's moving slowly. And once we start to see more of that, I think it will have a real impact and prevent that continuing creep and even reverse some of that. But it's still very early in that game.
Really interesting. And I think since we are lucky enough to have two lawyers on the panel today, I'm going to come at that question from another angle that somebody put in the chat. And this is about data subject access request. And the question is essentially, what is your prediction as how DSARs to employers might play out in California? Will this be seen as another arrow in a disgruntled employee's quiver should they decide to pursue employment litigation? So basically, I think the question is this going to be a tool against employers as an unintended consequence of supporting access to data rights?
100%. It's already weaponized. For anyone who works in a company that has a large presence in the EU, data subject access requests made under the GDPR are pretty much a de facto expectation. And very often many companies have done an amazing job of setting up systems to respond to customer DSARs, the data that's there. But they're also doing so from a point of they're responding to the customer DSAR. The customer doesn't know anything about the insides or operations of the company, as opposed to an employee that can know a great deal about the internal operations of the company. What chat systems does the company use? Are there Dropbox? What HR tools have they been exposed to? Which managers should you look at? And it really becomes a very easy shot across the bow to go after a company and submit a data subject access request instead of having to file a lawsuit and then make a request through your firm. And I've seen letters, you'll get letters, and it's very clear that this is not disgruntled employee Bob who's looking at this and saying, please tell me what data you have about me, and submitting it. No, this is disgruntled employee Bob goes to his lawyer, and the lawyer coaches him on how to do it. And then it comes back, and you'll even, and there's forms out there. There's forms for making requests to DSARs. There's forms for making employee requests. And we're seeing this now with European employees, and we're going to see it in California. And it's one of those things that I think it needs to be addressed by companies building systems that take DSARs into consideration for employees and not just customers, and taking those systems into consideration. But they're difficult to respond to, because when you're responding to an employee DSAR, information about them may be bound up with information about other employees, and you don't want to violate their rights. So often you can find yourself having to chase this, redaction, much as you might in a document production and litigation, but you're doing it merely while responding to this regulatory inquiry. And more so in Europe than in California, there is a heavy hammer hanging if you fail to respond appropriately.
Well, thank you for that. Really interesting. And I'm getting the nod that we're almost out of time, unfortunately. So this last question is going to be a lightning round. And I just want to say again, Greg and Will, thank you so much for your insights from literally the front lines of these questions. It's been really, really fun to talk with you. And I hope we get to do it again. But last round, lightning round, because we love to do this as an exchange between industry and academia and sort of share what which other sides are seeing. 30 seconds, if you could wave a magic wand and request that academia do one piece of research, that you can't get done in your environment for whatever reason, but that would really help you in your work to address these issues in privacy and security, what would it be? And Will, I'll go to you first.
I would love a very deep dive, and I know there's been some of this already, but a very deep dive on the impact of such an incredible transformation to the digital world on employee morale and employee psychology. I think it's really early, and in 10 years from now, the amount of data we have and the amount of activity that we have to look at, it obviously is going to be much larger. But I can't tell where this is going to go. I mean, we're in the middle of the great resignation, they say, where lots of people are quitting their jobs. And is that just because their savings have increased as asset prices have risen lately? Or is it because they're absolutely miserable looking at a Zoom all day instead of being in the office? What does all of this mean to the way people feel about being at work? Which, as a manager, you don't always have great insight. So I'm very interested to see how this plays out, how sustainable it is. Does it net out as a positive because people have so much more autonomy? Does it net out as a negative because people feel like they're being surveilled or people isolated? Just sort of the overall impact on the human experience at work, I think, is going to be very central to how we look at this huge transformation.
Yeah. I mean, as we were chatting before the panel started, we don't know the long-term impacts of not having that friendly smile when you walk into the office, and how do you balance that with more productivity because people aren't commuting, for example. So great question, and I commend it to my research colleagues.
I'll make a 50-page report in the next 2 or 3 days, summing it all up. If you don't mind. That's an easy one, right?
Super easy. Yeah, very easy methodologically. Yeah. Greg, what about you? What's your wave a magic wand wish for research?
I would love to see efficacy research on what is the legitimate efficacy of the vast array of performance monitoring and employee monitoring and surveillance techs at actually driving security and productivity. I know we've seen studies that show, hey, hybrid workers may be actually more productive, but it's very mixed. But I'd like to see, companies have adopted, fairly privacy violative technologies and processes. Are those actually good for anything? Or at the end of the day, are they doing more harm than good? Is the erosion of trust, more damaging to the economic and viability or commercial success of an organization than me getting up and getting lunch or playing with my dog or ducking out to take care of my kid. And particularly, let's look at that not with lawyers or computer programmers who can be, lawyers were easily measured. How many hours did you bill? Computer programmers, did you make your target dates? But let's look at this for people who are doing other sites of work where we have these false quantizations of, human productivity, and see if we can figure out, does this actually help or does it hurt?
Well, thank you for that. I know that the audience is really interested in both of those ideas. So we so much appreciate it. And I wish we could talk for another hour, but I am going to say thank you again and turn it back over to Rachel to close us out.
Thank you, Anne. And yes, thank you again, Will and Greg, for a fantastic discussion. I am now going to also thank our community supporters and partners, some of the foundations that you see here, as well as our industry partners who help make events like this possible. And a big thank you to the audience. As promised, I want to share a few ways that you can keep in touch with Will and Greg, as well as CLTC. Follow us on Twitter or head to the CLTC website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you don't miss future events that are just like this one and much more from CLTC. And Will and Greg have kindly provided some contact info for you to reach out to them. So I'll leave this slide up for just a minute in case folks want to jot down any of this information. And it's just a big thank you once again to everyone in the audience for joining us today and engaging in this discussion. And stay tuned for more events and announcements from CLTC. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Good seeing you all.